Good evening. I'm Gretchen Crosby Sims, the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. We are pleased to be hosting tonight's vital conversation on the future of immigration reform with our distinguished panel of guests, who will be introduced in just a moment. We are grateful to them all for joining us, but I would like to say a special thank you to Matt Lewis, who has been a visiting Pritzker Fellow at the Institute this quarter. Alfonso Aguilar of the Latino Partnership for Conservative Principles had to back out of tonight's conversation unexpectedly, and Matt, who has been leading a fascinating seminar for students on conservatism in thought and action this quarter, graciously agreed to take his place. We are in the final days of our programming this quarter, and I wanted to invite you all to join us for the last few sessions until we resume programming this fall. Tomorrow, David Axelrod will be moderating a discussion between two former congressmen, David Jolly and Patrick Murphy, about bipartisanship in an era of gridlock. This event is co-sponsored by the Harris School's Project on Political Reform. This Thursday, former National Security Advisor Tom Donilon will be talking with Ann Gearan of the Washington Post about security challenges facing the U.S. Next Tuesday, May 29th, CNN's chief national security correspondent Jim Sciutto will lead former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper in conversation about his sobering and important book, Facts and Fears: Hard Truths from a Life in Intelligence. Next Wednesday, May 30th, Kim Hart of Axios will be leading a conversation with top tech reporters from the Washington Post and Politico about the challenges of regulating Facebook and other social media platforms. So we are finishing with a strong group of interesting panels. We hope you'll come to some of them. You can find out more about them at our website at politics.uchicago.edu. Tonight, we will be opening up the floor to take questions from the audience. Please line up behind the microphone that will be in the center aisle. And as is our typical custom, we reserve the first 3 questions for students. Please make sure that your phones are silent. And here to formally introduce our speaker is Danielle Schmidt. Danielle is a 3rd year from Wauconda, Illinois, studying philosophy and public policy. She is the incoming president of New Americans at UChicago, a civic engagement program at the IOP. New Americans gives UChicago students the opportunity to help permanent residents prepare for their naturalization exam and complete paperwork to become citizens. We are very proud of their work. Please join me in welcoming Danielle.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Quadrangle Club. Thank you for coming tonight, and especially for your interest in immigration reform. Today, the world of immigration policy is changing fast. With each passing day, there are new questions to be asked and new problems to be solved. The fate of immigration reform will be perhaps the legacy of this current political era, and overcoming its challenges will certainly be no easy task. Now, more than ever, answering the big questions that will arise tonight is imperative for the future of American immigration policy. Tonight, we are joined by moderator Tal Koppen, one of UChicago's own, graduating with a degree in Law, Letters, and Society. Currently, she is a political reporter for CNN, covering news from immigration to cybersecurity. In the past, she has covered significant events such as former Governor Rod Blagojevich's trials and the election of current Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel. Our first panelist is Bipartisan Policy Center's Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy, Teresa Cardinal Brown. Teresa comes to the panel as an expert on immigration policy, serving in policy advisor roles for the U.S. Customs and Border Protection and the Department of Homeland Security. Also on stage, we have Matt Lewis, current IOP Pritzker Fellow, senior columnist at the Daily Beast, and CNN political commentator. Matt has contributed to the Wall Street Journal, Politico, the Washington Post, the Telegraph, and many more publications. He is a well-respected political commentator, blogger, and podcast host, and has been named as one of the 50 best conservative columnists every year since 2013. Last but certainly not least is Lorella Praeli, Director of Immigration Policy and Campaigns at the American Civil Liberties Union, where she leads a grassroots movement for immigration reform along with fellow policy advocates, organizers, and activists across the country. Before joining the ACLU, Lorella served as the National Latino Vote Director for Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign and as the Director of Advocacy and Policy for United We Dream. Thank you all for being here this evening. This conversation promises to be insightful and productive in understanding the very complex future of immigration reform. Please join the Institute of Politics and myself in welcoming this wonderful group of panelists. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Danielle and Gretchen, and thanks to all of you here and hopefully online who are tuning into this. I wanted to start with something that's happening right now in true CNN fashion this very minute. and I'm going to give just a little bit of an overview because I imagine most of you are not tracking this as closely as I am on a daily basis. But right now in Congress, there's a bit of a procedural maneuver that's on the verge of potentially forcing an immigration vote on the House floor over the objections of House Speaker Paul Ryan and his leadership team. And I just checked before we came out here. The House is done voting for today. We're at 20 Republicans of 25 that could potentially force this vote. And it's been sitting right around there. And what it's called a discharge petition. What it would do if all Democrats sign on, we're close to that point as well, and these 25 Republicans, is it would force a series of 4 votes on bills that would address the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals policy, which you've probably heard as DACA, and something else. So border security, perhaps a series of much more hardline, aggressive measures on immigration. And this has been sort of consuming the House for the past week and a half. So with that sort of backdrop, again, since this is right now what is sort of the talk of the Hill, I wanted to turn it over to our panelists to talk about where you think this might be going, as in anywhere. Do you think we'll get there? And why do you think that? And what does it mean more broadly for potentially the first significant step we could maybe see on addressing DACA since the president opted to end it last September?
I'll be happy to go first. First of all, thank you all for coming. Thanks to you, Chicago, for inviting me. So what's fascinating about this is that this process of a discharge petition basically it's probably the most democratic thing that Congress can do, because it allows rank and file members to bring bills to the floor, regardless of whether they've been through committee, regardless of whether the leadership wants them to go. And it's because of that, it forces members to have to vote against their own leadership. That's a huge step. If you're voting against your own party leadership, that can have ramifications of everything from the campaign money that those leaders help give to your reelection campaigns to where you're going to be put on committees next time around if you're reelected. So it's a really big deal. The fact that it's even this close is remarkable. The fact that it's this close on an immigration issue is even more remarkable.
And was introduced by Republicans.
It was introduced by Republicans. What makes it close to getting over the line, however, and this needs to be clear, is not that a majority of Republicans are for this. It's that almost all the Democrats are for this and just enough Republicans to give you a majority of the House. So what does this mean? It is very close, but leadership is trying very, very hard to find a way for this not to happen. So they're working overtime to try to find something else that they can promise to this group of Republicans, as well as the more conservative Republicans who, frankly, tanked the annual agricultural bill, farm authorization bill, the farm bill, because they wanted to vote on the harsher immigration bill. They're trying to figure out if they can negotiate a path forward between those two that would allow Republicans to basically control the floor again without relying on all these Democrats. Because of that, because the leadership does have all the levers of the power for the most part, and because it's such an extraordinary thing for members to go so strongly against their leadership, I'm frankly doubtful that at the end of the day, this will happen. I think leadership will figure out a way to rein in their members and put something else on the floor that will, manage the situation. That having been said, the fact that we're this close and that this is happening just tells you how big an issue immigration has become in this country right now. There are enough members of the Republican Party who feel electoral pressure to deal with this. Democrats have been calling for it for a very long time, and this is now an issue that Congress is going to have to wrestle with one way or another.
Yeah, and shameless plug, you of course can track all of this, my and my colleagues' coverage of it at CNN.com. But yes, I mean,
it's the DC soap opera is following Congress.
But I mean, it absolutely is true that leadership is frantically. I mean, meetings upon meetings. I can tell you, I was at the Capitol staking them out until late into the evening, trying to come up with some answer for these moderates. But to your point, what really kicked this into another gear was last Friday, conservatives were so frustrated that their moderate colleagues had done this, that they tanked a completely unrelated bill that most conservatives would tell you is, on the wish list. It would have constituted, entitlement reform. It was sort of the holy grail, and they tanked that because they were so frustrated that their moderate colleagues had a point of leverage that they didn't. So
for me, what really interests me about this is, would Donald Trump veto it?
right.
Because if you assume he would, and I think he probably would, then this is all just symbolism over substance. It's fun to watch, and it's symbolic. And those moderate Republican congressmen get to go before their constituents and say, we fought as hard as we could to do immigration reform or to save the Dreamers. But it really isn't substantive. It really doesn't matter. But the interesting thing, I think, is with Donald Trump, you never really know what he's going to do. I mean, he'll come out of a meeting and say, let's do gun control, I did a deal. Or I want to save those kids and be the hero. And if there is some other enforcement mechanisms that are paired with the DACA part, I mean, I think it's within the realm of possibility that not only would this discharge petition work, but that maybe the president actually signs it.
Well, and so far, no one has done anything, right? The Senate tried and failed. The House hasn't done anything. The White House can't seem to get, a preferred path. And the answer is always, well, it won't become law. And that's what we're hearing this time, too. Paul Ryan says, well, the president won't sign it. The Senate said, well, the House will never pass it. The House said, well, the Senate will never take it up. So it's,
And with Trump, though, I mean, it's the last person who talks to him sometimes. And if he sees, if there's some way that he could declare victory, I'm the one who saved these kids and we got funding for a wall.
I think that was our theory. That was the working theory for the last 6 months, and it failed. And I think it's because it's not Donald Trump making the decision. It's Stephen Miller and others who surround him. But I sort of want to step back for a quick second. I know that this is the Institute of Politics, and it's so quick to get into the politics of this issue. But I just want to put a pause on who we're talking about, right? This is not fun to watch. This is not easy. The solution is easy. I was one of these people before I was able to naturalize and become a US citizen. And so whenever we have these conversations and we sit down and talk about the politics of immigration and what it may take to get a solution through the line and sort of the back and forth and what Republicans or Democrats may do on the Hill, it's just important to remember we're talking about people whose lives have been uprooted since Donald Trump took office. Not only because we're living in this moment where the culture of fear is what dominates and how this administration is functioning as it relates to this issue, but because we're telling young undocumented people who've grown up in our country that they've got to live their lives and plan around tweet by tweet, injunction to injunction, legislative maneuver to legislative maneuver. And there's just no way to actually plan your life from that perspective and with that set of circumstances. And so as we turn to this conversation and continue on the discharge petition and the politics of immigration reform and DACA and DREAM Act specifically, on the Dreamers, this is not controversial. Most of the American public is there. We know what the solutions are. We've had a bill first introduced in 2001. Right? To me, the question right now is, does Speaker Ryan have the courage and the guts and the leadership to put the bill on the floor for a vote? How does, and then we sort of move into the challenges with the Senate, and then ultimately we still have the Trump factor, right? Which is, even if we were able to get a bill through the House and the Senate, how do we get the president to sign it when we're not actually negotiating with Donald Trump? We don't have someone like George W. Bush or President Obama, all imperfect presidents on this issue. But we just don't have that kind of certainty or leader in the White House, right? And so it sort of calls into question what is possible in the next 3 years.
And to your point, let's take another moment of context. So when we talk about DACA, this is a program that President Obama put into place in 2012 through executive action that basically deferred action on this specific category of individuals. There's some requirements. You had to have been here before a certain date. You had to be a certain age. But basically, young undocumented immigrants who came to the U.S. as children, most of them, the statistics show, have basically never known another country. They've grown up here. Many of them, if you talk to them, describe not even knowing they were undocumented. until they had to get a driver's license or apply to college. And it is absolutely true that this is, you talk to almost any member of Congress, even the ones who are advocating for some of the most, conservative, aggressive policies, acknowledge that these are, people that deserve help. The question is the trade. But I want to talk about a different aspect of this, which is when, President Trump came into office with the conservative perspective on what Obama did, which was that because it was an executive action, it is unconstitutional and this should be something done legislatively. So that sort of was the justification for ending it in September. There are now 2 federal judges and 2 circuit courts who are already considering these decisions who have said that justification was not valid. But while that is being worked out, the conservative states who started all of this by telling Trump, if you don't end this, we're going to sue, have now sued. And we have the potential this summer, in the next few months, of having different circuit courts of the United States ruling differently. One saying, get rid of the program altogether, and others saying, no, you need to keep signing people up for these 2-year permits. So, Laurel, I'm going to throw it back to you. The ACLU is involved in probably most, if not all, of these pieces of litigation in some capacity. What do you think is the impact of the court decisions on whether this all gets done legislatively?
I mean, I go back to the fact that only Congress can give us the kind of certainty that these young people have been working for. The courts cannot give us a pathway to citizenship, right? The courts can give us a pause right now or can try to let the program continue. Ultimately, this is an executive program. And so the administration, you could see a scenario where they sort of take on a Muslim ban, a strategy similar to what they did with the Muslim ban, where they went back to the drawing board, they issued a new policy directive. I mean, I think the political pressure is so high and the favorability of this issue and the organizing and power building around it is so different that it makes it hard for the administration to do that. But I think that we're seeing a scenario where we're gonna potentially walk into conflicting rulings, and it creates this crisis moment for the federal government, right? Where the federal government has to decide which do you follow, and if you follow, court decision if you follow the ruling from New York, are you then held in contempt because you're not following the one from Texas potentially? And so ultimately, I feel like we've got to solve this in Congress, but I'm not optimistic about what we're up against. I don't think that this policy debate was ever about Dreamers and the DACA population for the Trump administration. I think from the very beginning, it was using the plight of young undocumented immigrants to try to advance a broader enforcement-centric agenda and essentially use people like my sister, who's a DACA recipient, as a bargaining chip to advance a broader, very different vision of our country. Now, we should have policy debates about all of these other policy issues, but we should not be using the lives of young people to have those conversations.
Of course, the term taking hostage got used a lot. Democrats got accused of trying to take hostage government funding to get something done on DACA. I mean, do you want to talk a little bit about the give and take?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the struggle, right? Immigration is a political issue. Immigration is an intensely personal issue for everybody on all sides of it. No matter what side of the debate you take, most people take it very, very personally, for any reason or another. So there is this disconnect. There's this disconnect between the intensely emotional nature of the immigration debate and the game of politics, which has always been about negotiation, give and take, compromise, from the founding of our country. 3/5 compromise, people, right? So it's hard and harder when if you're negotiating about I don't know, something that's sort of less personal, it's easier. But when you're negotiating about people and people's lives, including, people who are more on the, enforcement conservative side, they think it's about their lives as well. That makes it harder. So in some ways, that's the challenge, right? It's finding the policy math that can get you the political votes, the trade-offs that will, get the people who want more enforcement on board and enough of the people who want a legalization on board, and can you mix and match to get enough votes to pass with that intensely emotional issue that drives a lot of people to take absolutely hardline, non-negotiable positions and then yell at their legislators when they don't do the same. And so that results in people being more fearful of primary voters than of somebody from the other side and taking those hard positions. And that's exactly what the speaker is dealing with right now, right? He's dealing with people who want to try to make a deal, who are willing to come to a compromise, and another group of people in his own conference who are like, no, 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 do not compromise. Do not give them that vote. Because if you give them that vote, you'll win, and my constituents won't like that, and I won't like that. So don't give them a win, because I'll lose. And the speaker's like rocking a hard place. That's the political nature where we're at.
And Matt, this is not an issue that's clean for the Republican Party, right? I mean, it's actually, it cuts the political spectrum in some really interesting ways, right?
Yeah, including I think something like 70 to 80% of Republicans want to protect the Dreamers, and so I don't think I personally don't think it's that it's unethical or bad to sort of to say we're going to do something to fix DACA, because I agree that Congress has to do it. In fact, Barack Obama, before he did DACA, said numerous times that it was unconstitutional for him to unilaterally do it, and then he did it. So I don't have a strong moral problem with sort of let's do DACA and also at the same time do enforcement. But even if I did, the practical reality is you just can't do it. Like if we actually want to protect the Dreamers, there's not going to be the votes there unless we also negotiate with the other side and give them something that they want. So I actually think this is a missed opportunity for Republicans and for Donald Trump to become the hero. I mean, I think that Donald Trump, it could be only like an only Nixon goes to China sort of thing, that Donald Trump, because the base trusts him on immigration, because he said so many horrible things, he sort of has I know this is a perverse thing, but he sort of has the credibility to do an immigration reform bill in a way that like a George W. Bush or a John McCain wouldn't have had the credibility from the base. They wouldn't have been. So Trump is trusted by the base. Why not say, look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to fully fund the wall. We're going to go to merit-based immigration. So if you're worried about assimilation, good news. We're actually going to slow down illegal immigration and even legal immigration, but we're going to do something to protect all of these kids who, by the way, seem to be assimilated pretty well and were brought here through no fault of their own. I think that this is an opportunity that Republicans and Donald Trump are actually missing.
But now you're moving into, I just feel like you're moving into a comprehensive immigration reform policy framework.
So that's sort of what I want to talk about next, because we could, discuss, I think, DACA particularly every day, because it is one of the first times we have an actual sort of triggering, policy potentially getting taken away. But I think, one of the underlying currents in all of this, we can sort of all talk about how long folks have been doing these issues, is that consistently, year after year, Congress after Congress, president after president, Congress has sort of abdicated its role and failed to pass any of these reforms, no matter which party was in control. So I wanted to use that as a way to broaden the conversation a little bit about why is this issue so difficult for Congress, and what are some of the, Matt, you discussed merit-based, which, sounds very reasonable, right? Sort of tailoring the immigrants coming into this country with the needs of the country. But, a lot of folks in Washington, especially on the Democratic side, will say that can be a code word for cutting substantially the ways that people can come to this country. And in fact, one of the bills that's out there that would supposedly turn us into a merit-based system, is what it's billed as, would cut overall legal immigration to green cards by 50%. So, you know, even just saying something like that, which sounds like common sense, the devil is totally
I think one of the things that I've advocated is, and by the way, I have been a conservative who has advocated for, like I supported the Rubio-Schumer bill, and I supported the McCain immigration bill. So I've sort of been pushing for that, but I've tried to become compassionate as well and sympathetic to the other arguments. The guy in Ohio who's lost his job and who's worried about automation and immigration and globalization. I've tried to really put myself in their shoes a little bit, because I do think, you know, that, I mean, my dad was a prison guard for 30 years, so in Hagerstown, Maryland, I come from that background, but I've lived in DC for 10 or 15 years, and the experience that people have living in New York City or Washington, DC, dealing with immigrants, even illegal immigrants, is pretty awesome, actually. And maybe it's not always the case. I'm not really competing with an immigrant for a manufacturing job. So I've really tried to put myself in their place. And one of the things that does occur to me is that we are nearing the percentage of foreign-born, the highest that we've had. So I think it's like 13% right now, percentage of foreign-born people living in America. I think the high point was something like 15%. I don't know what the number is, right? So like from my standpoint, I think diversity is great and immigration's great, but there certainly has to be some percentage that's too much. Like, when is it impossible to assimilate people into the national fabric? Is it 20%? I don't know what that number is, or it's actually not a number, but it's a percentage because the country keeps getting bigger. But there must be a percentage, and to say that there is almost sounds intolerant. But no one really wants to talk about that. And I think that's sort of like, when can we no longer assimilate people into American democracy?
Lorella, I feel like you're dying to.
I'm not dying. I just, you know, I have a different perspective, and I feel like it's I feel like every new group has been met with skepticism in our history. And it wasn't until they became defenders of the American dream themselves that they were fully embraced. And it takes time, and change can be difficult for some. But, you know, I came from Peru, and my mother came from Peru. I was 10 years old. She was much older. And we're both Americans. And, you know, I see that every day in my life, that the question becomes, how do we define American? And so is it the color of your skin? Is it the language that you speak? Is it the culture that you practice, the religion? What is it? How do we actually define it? And I think really generations before me have defined it by being active members of their communities. They've integrated, they've brought their own culture, and that is who we are as a nation. So I just have a fundamentally different take on this. That does not mean that I don't recognize that there are many people around our country who are feeling a tremendous amount of anxiety because their neighborhoods look different. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it takes time. And I think it means we have to have an open conversation about what it is that we're seeing, what we're experiencing, but what we've seen. And I mean, I worked the elections, and I saw how Donald Trump exploited people's economic anxieties and made it about immigrants. I see how he's exploiting people's feelings today about security and their sense of security, right? Where he's taking categories of young brown kids and adolescents and labeling them as gangs and animals. And that is coming, that the attempt to dehumanize individuals is done in an effort to try to justify cruel policy. And that's what I see happening at the White House. I'm not saying that's your perspective by any means, right? But that's what he's done. And he's put us in I sort of feel like we're in this crisis moment as a country, because it really, we're having this conversation about what it means to be American and how we move forward from this moment. But I also feel a tremendous amount of optimism and hope, because I think many people are rising up to the occasion and are saying, actually, that is not how we define our country. I'm gonna stand up and fight back. I mean, at the ACLU, we've gone from 400,000 members pre-Trump to 1.8 million members. And one of the first things that we did is we asked our activists and our base to take action to engage with their local law enforcement, to enact local policies. And people held 1,500 meetings with law enforcement because they wanted something to do, right, as members of the ACLU and really as part of this country. And so, you know, I have a different perspective.
Yeah. I think one of the mostly unspoken things here is that some Democrats and some Republicans both secretly believe that more immigrants will equal more Democrats. And I believe, thanks to Donald Trump, they're right. That it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If people think you don't like them and that you don't want them to be here, they probably will vote for the other party. And so now, I don't think that was a foregone conclusion, but I think it's become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
You don't have to be, right?
Well,
You don't have to-
let's Teresa jump in here.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things. One is, Lorella is right. We have always in this country had ambivalence toward immigration. Immigrants and the other, define it how you will, is always the easy scapegoat whenever you don't feel comfortable about what's happening to you. When people feel like they don't have control over their own lives and they're not sure who's in control, they look for somebody to blame, and immigration has always been there. But let's be clear, immigrants and immigration have never been the cause nor the solution of all the things that go wrong in the United States, whether it's economic, whether it's security, or anything else. They never have been that. And so looking to our immigration system to fix it in whatever way you think will solve those problems is not going to work. We have to look at our immigration system and figure out, what do we want it to be? What should it be? And I think one of the things that's driving a lot of the conversation now, I'm going to set aside Donald Trump and his rhetoric for a moment, but outside of Donald Trump, in other places in the country that may have voted for Donald Trump, is the sense that they don't get it. What is our immigration system trying to do? Is there anybody in charge of it? They look and they see that there are an awful lot of immigrants. They remember that a lot of them came illegally in the 20, 30 years ago. They believe that that's still happening, although it's not. And so they look and they go, there's no control. No one's got their hand on the steering wheel of our immigration system to help figure out how it's working for us. And if nobody's doing that, then that's a problem. And so is that problem the immigrants' problem? It's probably not the immigrants' fault, but it's that nobody's been in charge, and nobody's been in charge for quite a while in their mind. So they're looking to the federal government, they're looking for somebody to say, I'm gonna take charge. And Trump did. He said, I'm gonna take charge, and I'm gonna take charge in this way. Now, I personally don't agree with all of the ways that he's saying to take charge, but that I can see why that would be attractive if you feel like the immigration system has not worked and has not been functioning for a while. But what does that mean for where do we go from here? I think we do need to figure out, how do we talk about our immigration system and immigrants in the ways that they have always been what makes America great, right? If you want to make America great again, America's great in part because of immigrants. So maybe immigrants can help us make America great again, if that's what you want to do. How do we do that? Do we need to look at the system and how we do it? First of all, we need to recognize where we are right now and the fact that, okay, there are 11 million people here who don't have legal papers, but they've been here, most of them, for 20 years. Does it make sense to really kick them out now, no matter whether they came as kids or not? Are we going to pay money to do that? Just pragmatically, most people would say, yeah, no, let's find a way for them to get right with the law. We can find a way to get them legal. Matter of fact, if you ask most Americans, especially people who think that there's a problem with illegal immigration, they have this misconception that there's already a way for them to get legal and they're just choosing not to do it. Let me just say clearly right now, for 95% of these folks, there is not a way to get legal. It doesn't exist. They cannot do it.
They'd probably have to go to their home country for 10
They
years.
would have to go home for another 10 years after they've been here for 20 or 30 raising kids, right? Like that just, the logic of that doesn't make sense. But most Americans would say, okay, well, let's find a way to make them legal, give them some things to do, and they have to get in line and whatever else to make them do. Okay, fine. But then let's figure out how we don't get to this situation again. And that's where border security comes in, the idea of a wall, which I think is completely impractical, but something to say, let's figure out how we fix the system so that going forward, we have a system where most people who come We understand why and how they're coming. They're coming in a system that makes sense to us and we think is helping them help us become a greater America, whether that's merit-based, and there's a whole lot about how you define that. And then let's make sure that those rules are followed for the most part. Let's have a system that says legality becomes the norm. And then the public can have faith in the system again. I think that's where we need to go on a policy level. I think that's how we can convince Americans to get back on the immigration is good train, because immigration is good for America for a whole lot of reasons, but we need to convince Americans to get back on that. And when you do that, then you can find ways to get the parties in Congress to get back on the train.
So I feel like this is often where these kinds of conversations go, where it seems so obvious, right? It seems like there's this, there were a number of times where covering the fits and starts on the Hill, I was like, I feel like I could write this bill. This is so common sense. Everyone's talking about the same thing in general. There is a cynical take that you hear levied from both sides against the other, that at the end of the day, there are enough politicians in both parties who want to keep this issue as a political wedge, right? Republicans say Democrats walked away when they were in charge because they thought it would help keep their base motivated. There are others who say, Republicans can't agree to a deal because they want to keep that sentiment alive that, brought Trump into office. What do you guys say to that argument? And why do you think this seemingly so common sense, obvious thing remains so elusive?
I'll say a pox on both their houses. I mean, it takes leadership, right? You have to be willing to do, and frankly, I think it has to come down to voters electing people who will be willing to do something rather than nothing. If you punish people at the election booth for doing nothing, that will come back to Washington. If they're right now, they're afraid. Why do we not have votes? Why is Ryan so afraid of having this vote? Because he's got members for whom that vote will become a weapon in their election campaign. The fact that they voted, forget which way they voted. Some members will get hit for voting one way. Some members will get hit for voting another way. They're afraid to vote, so they're not voting on anything. Well, that's ridiculous. You elect members of Congress to go to Washington to vote.
Yeah. So let me ask this question from the conspiratorial, paranoid right wing. Let's just assume that Republicans did what I think would be the smart thing. So let's say that tomorrow, we've got midterms coming up, right, in November. Let's say tomorrow Republicans put a bill on the floor that would take care of the DACA kids, would have a pathway to citizenship. You have to pay a penalty. You have to wait 10 years, but there's a pathway to, you get legalization, assuming you don't have a criminal record, right? Mm-hmm. But there's a pathway to citizenship. So we're taking care of the dreamers. There's a pathway to citizenship, fully funds a wall, and goes to the merit-based immigration system, right? So that's a trade-off. That's a compromise trade-off. Let's say Republicans put that on the floor tomorrow. We have a potential for Donald Trump to be a Republican president, to get credit for being the president, just like Reagan did in '86. Donald Trump could be the guy who did amnesty, who protected the kids from being deported. Would Democrats support that, or would they come up with a reason not to support it? I don't know.
Well,
I don't know.
So, again, you said we'll
they
just
weren't
do
able to do that?
merit-based, which is a lot more complicated than, let's
But that's a
remember.
trade-off. It's a
Well,
compromise.
yes, but let's remember, in the 11th hour of the funding negotiations, Schumer went to Trump with a $25 billion wall for DACA deal, and it was rejected. And there was another bill that, sort of played with legal immigration and had border security in it all.
I'm just saying, let's assume the crazy notion that you actually could negotiate with Donald Trump, and I do believe it's like Schumer said, negotiating with Jell-O. But let's just pretend that you could take Donald Trump at his word, and we really were going to put together a compromise solution that would give.
Well, I think
the fact is, I actually don't know if Democrats would support it.
Well, so Lorella, one of the things I hear a lot from the advocacy community, with who I know you're quite in touch with, is, the DACA recipients themselves say, and will tell you, we're not going to make a deal that gives us something at the expense of our families, our communities. So, I mean, do you want to talk about, I mean, again, you know, I know that there are also plenty in the advocacy community who would blame Democrats for getting us into this mess, you know, several years ago, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to, we're sort of in this, because I don't believe that we end up where we're hypothesizing we would, where I just don't think it's enough for Donald Trump. And so we keep on moving this conversation, we keep on changing the goalpost, right? And so we keep on adding additional policy trade-offs in order to secure protections for DACA recipients who, mind you, have those protections or had those protections. So Donald Trump could decide to keep DACA in place. We don't even have to address this right now. If he's uncomfortable and Congress can't deliver, we believe that DACA is constitutional. Nearly 800,000 young people around the country have a work permit. They're able to drive lawfully. They're able to have temporary protection from deportation. So let's just keep that, right? But they've chosen to use this issue to drive a broader agenda. We're not negotiating family-based immigration versus merit-based immigration. That's usually a conversation that we have around comprehensive immigration reform. That's not the conversation we're having. We're not talking about whether or not to legalize and how to legalize 11 million people. We're talking about fixing a problem that Donald Trump created. And I don't say that as a talking point. I really do believe that my sister's life was very different before Donald Trump came into office. And I believe that it didn't have to change. That he didn't have to do what he decided to do, but it was done in order to advance, to create so much chaos, and to give the impression, like he sort of came at it by saying, they're going to sue me, and so I want to save these kids. And then at every opportunity in turn where there was potentially something on the table, they kept on moving it. So it wasn't just border and DACA, it was DACA and border, then merit-based immigration, then the diversity visa, then enforcement, sanctuary cities, and the gang bill. And so it just sort of, so why should we engage in that conversation? I mean, as an advocate, I feel, why should I be having a public conversation about what are fair trade-offs when I don't believe we're actually going to have it right now?
One question I have is this Donald Trump and Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon, or do they represent a decent chunk of the American public? Like, in other words, the people who elected them. And I know he didn't win the popular vote, but I think that there are millions of Americans out there who feel betrayed by the country and let down, and by people like John McCain and George W. Bush. And so whether he's right or wrong, I guess my point is that he is representing a constituency of Americans who, believe that we have an immigration problem right now, that we're not doing enough to assimilate, and if there is some form of amnesty, whatever that may be, that would be a real betrayal to them.
So I'm going to set up Teresa for one quick thing, and then we're going to go to the audience for questions. So if you are interested, I'd suggest you start queuing up, and a reminder that we want the first 3 questions to be from students. So start getting your questions ready. But you raise an interesting point, Matt, which that I found as a reporter is quite interesting. The polling on this is sort of all over the map, because it depends so much how you ask the question. So you have, Democrats saying 70-80% of Americans want these DACA kids protected, and they don't really care what comes with it. And then you have, folks on the farther right saying, no, 70% of Americans want, legal immigration only and enforcement. So Teresa, when you do research at Bipartisan Policy Center, how do you guys grapple with the fact that, judging what the American public actually wants seems to be an almost impossible task?
So you ask any pollster this question, and they will answer you truthfully. Americans are fully capable of having diametrically opposed positions in their head at the same time. So the answer is yes and yes. Yes, 80% of Americans would like to see Dreamers stay and have a legal pathway. And some 70% of Americans, including close to a majority of Republicans, would like to see the rest of the 11 million have a pathway to citizenship or a pathway to legal status, one or the other. But They also, at the same time, very much want to see the system enforced. And they want to see enforcement. And they want an immigration system that is merit-based. Merit-based can mean a lot of different things. What we're learning is merit-based isn't necessarily just the highest of the high-skilled or the best of the brightest. Merit-based for a lot of people is, are you law-abiding? Are you hardworking? Are you willing to learn English? Do you want to become American? For the most part, do you share our values? That's more important than do you have a degree? Are you in a STEM field? Are you going to be the next Einstein? Those are great. We want them too. But overall, a system that sort of takes all of that into account and says, is this a person we want to have? That's a system that people would go, okay, I get that. I can see that. That to me is merit. I can work with that. So I think a lot of it is just figuring out what that looks like. That's the devil in the details part.
Always.
What Lorella said is true. This current moment we're in, negotiating on the backs of dreamers for whatever else immigration we can get at this moment is, as you described it, completely ridiculous. But I would also say, if the president hadn't taken this action, the likelihood we'd be having any immigration debate whatsoever right now is next to nil. Congress wouldn't be moving anything, or whatever they try would be stalled. In part, you know, for whatever, how badly it was done, Congress doesn't move on controversial things like immigration without an action-forcing event. And what President Trump did was an action-forcing event. How do I know this? Because the minute the court stepped in and said, okay, we don't need to do this anymore, Congress went, phew, done. We don't have to talk about it again.
Yeah.
Right? So, you know, a bunch of Republicans and a whole lot of Democrats have now created another action-forcing event by this discharge petition. Like, okay, that's the moment we're in. Would I have done it differently? Sure. Was Trump right to do it? Probably not. Is it right to do this on the backs of dreamers? No, but here we are. So with this moment, what can we do? Well, what we can do is maybe make a deal. Maybe that deal will cover everything that you want it to do, maybe not. Maybe the deal will cover everything you want to do, maybe not. But is there a deal to be had? There might be a deal to be had. If there's a deal, let's look at what that deal is. Mm-hmm. If Trump really is going to be jello, and like he had 2 chances in early, you know, December and early this year in the Senate to take a deal, and he said no because people whispered in his ear and said, you can get more. If they're willing to give this much, you can get more. And the other side said, yeah, no, you can't get more for this. And he lost, and he got mad about it. He got so mad that he's willing to shut down the government again this fall if he doesn't get his wall, because he could have had his wall and he said no. So maybe there's a deal to be had, maybe there's not. I think we should see where it goes, but we shouldn't be afraid of taking a deal if there's a deal there.
So I do want to open it up for questions if there are any students that would like to ask one.
Hi, my name's Dylan. I'm a second year in the college. Obviously, we've been talking a lot about DACA here, and it's a very sympathetic group of people. I'm wondering if you can talk some about DAPA, which was stopped in the courts, I believe, right? And then also the temporary protected status that we're seeing Trump, it seems like every few weeks here, ending TPS for another class of people, meaning that, you know, tens of thousands of people are going to have to either leave the country or become undocumented. I'm wondering if you can talk about both of those issues.
So DAPA, like DACA with the P, Deferred Action for Parents of
Americans.
So that was an attempt to extend DACA. That is the challenge to that prevented it from ever going into effect is actually what the greatest threat to DACA is now in terms of the litigation, because it's the same judge who did that in Texas that now has this DACA case. And then temporary protected status, the decisions will soon stop because there aren't many left, but yes, this administration has ended protections that exist for when a country goes through some sort of emergency, like an epidemic or a natural disaster or civil war. It's sort of the idea you can't humanely deport people back to that situation. So there's a status that Congress has created that you can give those people. Somewhere around 400,000 people who have lived in the U.S., the vast majority of them for about 2 decades, who have had that taken away by this administration and ended. And there are only a few very small countries, including Syria, who are still covered by that status. So turn it over to you guys for your thoughts on that.
So a couple of things. One is the DAPA extension that Obama tried in 2014 was, his rationale was exactly the same as why he did DACA in 2012, which was, okay, I have this much discretion to do this for this group of people. Can I do more? Because, why? Because Congress hasn't been able to do anything, right? That really was the rationale. Congress has been unable, so I'm going to use everything in my administrative power to implement these policies that I think are right. The courts, struck that down and said, nope, you can't. That same group of states who sued over that are the ones who threatened DACA and then ultimately sued over DACA. So it was always controversial from a political standpoint. Legally, yes, you have a whole group of people who say it's legal and constitutional. Eventually, the courts are going to decide one way or the other. This will all get to the Supreme Court at some point, I am absolutely sure. TPS is a statutory provision. People had status under TPS. This was allowed by Congress. This isn't about whether or not the executive has the authority to do what they did. They do. The question about what was done with TPS was the right thing to do. TPS was created for temporary situations, but what happened is successive administrations, both Republican and Democrat, said the longer these people stay, the more equities they have, the harder it is to send them home, regardless of whether that original thing is still there or not. It's politically fraught. The easiest, least disruptive thing is just to extend this status. By doing so, people came to rely on it, and they came to believe that it would continue to be extended. This administration, with the authority it had, said, yeah, that's not right. We shouldn't take something that was intended to be temporary and essentially turn it into a permanent status. So they made the different decision. Now, that's terrible for every one of those people and every one of the communities that they live in and every one of those families. And yet, what is it doing? What are they saying about it? Christian Nielsen said, okay, Congress, you don't like what we did? Change the law. The bizarre think process of this administration is to put the onus back on Congress to try to fix the problem and stop kicking the can to the administrations to do it. Whether or not that gambit will be successful has remained to be seen, but that's their rationale. Their rationale is this is not the way the system was set up. We keep band-aiding it with administrative actions. Congress needs to take action. That's what they're trying to do. Again, but people's lives are in the balance because they're using them to gain political advantage to try to force Congress to do something.
And Laurel, do you want to jump in? I mean,
I'll be quick. I mean, I will just say Donald Trump ran on this. He ran on mass deportation. I think what we're seeing now is an effort to delegalize nearly 1 million people if you combine TPS and DACA. I agree, Congress should act. Congress isn't going to act. Maybe they will be forced to, but very hard, giving the current political context and who's in the White House. And so, I mean, today Betsy DeVos said that it's a school choice and a local community's decision to decide whether or not to invite ICE to come to the school and alert them about an undocumented student, right? And so that's the current moment we're in. It is not normal.
Which is, by the way, illegal.
Right? It is unconstitutional.
You can't do that.
It's unconstitutional. And so I think this part about taking status away from people who have it continues, it sort of it destabilizes the community. And it creates, I believe we're sort of in this moment where they're creating a culture of fear. It's sort of the attrition through enforcement strategy, right? Make it so hard on people that they choose to self-deport, that they opt to leave themselves. And we see that with an increase. We have an increase in courthouse arrests, right? That was traditionally known as a sensitive location where ICE would not show up and conduct arrests there. There are more arrests taking place when people are going and showing up to their green card interviews. And so should we have a legitimate conversation about who should have status, who should be able to get on a path to citizenship? Absolutely. It is our right. The public should debate it. Congress should debate it, right? But these set of actions are not random. They're part of an overarching strategy that the administration is executing.
And If we can move to the next question.
I was gonna say, this row, everyone who was in this row, nearly everyone got up.
As an alum, I'm happy to see plenty of students standing up to ask questions.
I love it.
Thank you so much for being here. Just kind of building off what you just said and also going back to a point you made about making legality the norm. To what extent, on a macro sense, where do you see the needle moving on this? Or do you feel like it just kind of flips back and forth with the changing administration and changing who has power in Congress? Or do you see kind of a stressed sway in like a macro sense?
I mean, until Congress acts, yes, it will sway from administration to administration. We've seen the largest pendulum swing between the last administration and this administration. They've literally, everything this administration done, let's do 180 degrees different. Congress is the one that can set the law and make it consistent. Because Congress has not acted, not changed the law, and not done anything about this, that's why we're seeing this diametrically opposed swing.
That's sort of true. I mean, the funny thing is that gets lost and sort of ironic these days is, 5 years ago, the left was calling Obama deporter in chief. And while arrests are way up of undocumented immigrants from the last 2 years of the Obama administration, if you compare them to the earlier years of the Obama administration, they're actually quite consistent. The difference, one
major difference is the rhetoric around it.
There was rhetoric. There's also what type of person is getting arrested. So the prioritization of criminals has largely been rolled back. But I mean, your question of getting back to legality and Matt, some of what we've been talking about, I mean, the question isn't do people want legality to be the norm? The question is how they define that, right?
Yeah.
And how do you
Well,
get
and
that?
I think a couple things. I do think that unfortunately we've seen globally that there is a trend toward xenophobia and nationalism and populism in America. Hasn't escaped that. But this, I think that no matter, regardless of the trend or the moment that we're in, which I think is especially toxic, this is a big issue, and it pits American values against American values. On one hand, you have compassion versus the rule of law. And you have the fact that I think immigrants provide us with energy and diversity and entrepreneurism and innovation versus assimilation, and the fact that that change does uproot societies and communities and displace people here. So this is a really big, I mean, it's an obvious point for me to make, but it shouldn't be surprising that Congress has a hard time coming to a solution and that this is such a heated topic, because it really does pit some fundamental American values against each other. That is all.
Hi, I'm Olivia. I'm a second year. I'm actually specializing in immigration, so thank you all for being here. Sure. My question is just mainly about the center. I know we've been talking a lot about the left and a lot about the right, but I think one of the issues with the center is that primarily people in the center fall back on economic arguments with respect to immigration. The value of an immigrant comes through with their value as a worker within the American system. And I'm posing to the panel just at large if we can ever have a conversation about true immigration reform without the center falling back on very non-controversial economic arguments because we're dealing with such a personal issue. So is there a way in which the center can take this issue more personally, or are we working with just a system in which the value of a person comes about through economics?
So I go back to what I said earlier. We're the Bipartisan Policy Center, so we try to find that middle, where's the middle, where's the compromise? And we thought that the economics was the way to kind of get both sides to the middle. Right? Okay, you believe immigration's good. Well, here's an economic argument that can help bridge that gap. And what we found is it's good, it's not enough. It's not sufficient. Why? For all the reasons you mentioned, right? Immigrants are more than their economic value, they're people. What they do in our society is more than the value of their labor or their purchasing power. It's all of those things that make the American experiment great and work and make people want to come here. And I think in part we've lost that in the debate. It's become about the immigrants themselves and not about the immigrants as part of America. And maybe that's part of the issue, is we need to go back to that. It's not immigrants and us. It's us. It's people becoming us and making us greater. That's why I said immigrants can help make America great again. Immigrants are needed to help make America great again. So I think that's part of the conversation we're trying to have is there a better way to talk about this that's not so either or, one side or the other, this or that. It's the both and. Because you need a system that's compassionate and honors the rule of law. Because you need one to get to the other. What we've heard over and over again is, of course we want to be compassionate, but it's hard to be compassionate if we feel like we're being taken advantage of and that no one's following the rules, right? So you can be generous when the rules are followed. You kind of have to figure out how you get to both.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other piece is we're sort of entering this period where I think we should start having a conversation about what are the right or new policy frameworks. And so I think we've tested and tried and failed several times in the last few decades on this issue. And so, you know, what's so challenging or hard about comprehensive immigration reform is that you have legalization and you have future flow and you have border and interior enforcement, you know, and on and on and on. And so what is the right approach is sort of the big question as we transition into some future where we may have federal legislative action on this, is what is the right policy framework? I think years ago people came up with and developed the Earned Pathway to Citizenship framework. Is that still the best framework? We hadn't seen Border and DREAM be a thing before. Right? Like DREAM was on its own for a long time. I mean, I think we would have the DREAM Act if Democrats had voted for it in 2010. You know, and I think immigrant youth in particular have been nonpartisan and have held Republicans and Democrats accountable for their positions on this issue. So anyway, I just put that out there because I think a lot of students here are probably studying policy and are thinking about policy and politics. And so how should we be approaching this issue in the future?
I think part of what's happened too, at least as I view it from looking at conservatives and how they've changed. And President George W. Bush said, family values don't stop at the Rio Grande. And now we have Donald Trump saying,
Build a wall.
Well,
At the Rio Grande.
even worse than that. So how do we get from there to here? And why is it that there's no constituency for Paul Ryanism or Marco Rubioism? And part of the reason of that, I think, as much as there have been studies that say that the economy has nothing to do with this, that this is about fear and culture, I think the economy does have something to do with it. When people feel abundant, when they feel safe, they have an abundance mentality, and they're more generous and compassionate. But when people feel scared and weak and poor, then they have a hoarding mentality. You know, it wasn't that long ago when typical conservative orthodoxy said that we could grow the pie, and that more people equals more ideas, and just because you get something doesn't mean I get less. And now we do have a zero-sum game. I think that the zero-sum game has actually won the Republican Party, and that's part of Trumpism.
Yeah, I was going to say, we didn't actually have a representative up here from.
I'm playing one though.
Yeah, you're trying. But what's interesting is that when you talk about the divides in the Republican Party, I mean, it's all economic in terms of how they make their argument. So, the folks at they call themselves immigration restrictionist groups that want less immigration. They make an economic argument. Now, as a journalist, I can say that it's held among a small minority of economists, but they say that the crux of their argument is not about some anti-immigrant mentality, they say, but it's about the fact that, no American wants these jobs. Well, it's because you're not paying them enough. And what immigration is doing is it's depressing the wages of everyone. And it's really interesting if you talk to them for a while, they start to sound a little like Bernie Sanders, but except for a few key details. But this has been an issue that economically has cleaved the parties in very complicated ways, pitting sort of the unions against the chamber in a way that doesn't normally align with the parties. And so I think part of it is that there is these sort of emotional social questions, but it's the economic issues that are really causing the complicated fissures, and I think that's part of the reason it keeps.
I would say that historically, yes, immigration has been more bipartisan, and you'd had wings of both parties that would look at the economic sort of arguments in favor of restriction. The labor Democrats were more traditionally skeptical of immigration. I used to joke that labor Democrats liked immigrants and didn't like immigration. Right? And then you had sort of the populist Republican side that sort of felt the same way, and they would sort of come around and shake hands, and you had a more bipartisan consensus between Democrats. What's happened, I think, in the last 5 to 10 years is Democrats have actually consolidated their position to be more widely pro-immigration and pro-immigrant. And Republicans have split further apart. And so the fact that Democrats are much more united in their position allows them to vote more together as a bloc, and has really caused those fissures in the Republican Party to become more widen and to become more clear, and to create more problems now that Republicans control the levers of government.
And we're really running low on time. We want to take 2 more questions. So what I'm going to have you do is the next 2 people in line, I want you to both quickly ask your question, and then we'll try to have
Lightning round.
the panelists do their best to answer both of them at the same time.
Okay, this might fit that pretty well. I'm Joe. I'm a second year in the college. I'm kind of interested in how you all like conceptualize the wall, because on one hand it's like a physical barrier, but I feel like on one hand, especially during the campaign, it's like a spiritual force and like a representation of like, we're going to pursue anti-immigration policy. Do you think the perception of that like differs between people of like different political affiliations?
Thank you.
I was wondering about September, if you thought Trump would back down again, because humiliation is a very important emotion for him. And this is the one issue, the omnibus bill, that really got his base angry. And like, it had no money for the wall, but it had money for border security in Tunisia. Do you think he can really back down again? So what do you think is going to happen in September?
Perfect. The wall is a symbol. You guys were thinking similarly. So the wall is a symbol.
So as the ex-DHS person who worked for Customs and Border Protection, inside DHS, even now, if you ask the Border Patrol, if you ask CBP about the wall, they'll say, yes, we need the wall, and we need technology, and we need personnel, and we need fences and barriers. So the wall's not going to be everywhere, but maybe pieces of the wall, right? Like, people who know the border and understand the border, they know that realistically there's not going to be the big, beautiful Trump wall from sea to shining sea. Even John Kelly.
The wall system.
The wall system, yes. They call it the wall system, which is their code for giving the president the wall, but not actually giving him the wall. And why is it important? Exactly as you said. If you ask the American public, the wall is symbolic. It's a symbol of taking control of the system back, right? So whether we get 12 feet of the wall or 12 miles of the wall or 1,200 miles of the wall, the act of building the wall is saying we're serious about enforcement. For Trump, however, he's a more literalist kind of guy. He got $1.6 billion in that bill he didn't like for various other parts of the wall system, but not the wall. And he got mad because he promised a wall. And he was very explicitly told in that bill, you don't get a wall, you get all these other things. So for him, it's literal. For a lot of other people, it's symbolic. For those whose job is to secure the border, it's not the be-all, end-all.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, I think a lot of his base would stick with him. I mean, they wouldn't abandon him if he doesn't build a wall. I think a lot of them thought he's promising 10, maybe we'll get 7, and we'll be happy with that. Nobody else is doing anything. I don't like the imagery of a wall symbolically. I don't like it, but I'm okay with it if it makes people happy, Americans happy who are upset, and if we were able to save dreamers. I would take that compromise and build the dang wall, as John McCain said.
I think much has been covered. I will just say, I think from the civil liberties perspective, it's important to understand that people live along the wall, or the border rather, sorry. And so whose rights are we infringing upon when we decide if and when we decide and where we decide to build it? And so I think it's just important. It's actually not just, when we think about border communities, they're quite diverse. We're talking about white ranchers whose land gets taken away, and then they have a hard time challenging it. We're talking about undocumented communities. We're talking about Latino communities. We're talking about all sorts of communities who occupy this area. And so, you know, what is the purpose of it? If it's just symbolic because we've got to give Donald Trump a win, a political win, or are we trying to achieve something? Is it to me, it feels wasteful, harmful, doesn't do great for who we are as a nation. But we also have to remember that we're talking about border communities.
And moderator's prerogative to have the last word. I will also encourage you, also as a journalist trying to cover these issues, to be a conscientious consumer of the news and recognize when the wall is the head fake, which it has been for most of the past year. Everyone in Congress kind of thought the wall was like the joke, like they were just going to spin their wheels for 6 months, and then at the end of the day, they would give the money for the wall, and whoever wanted to call it a wall could, and whoever wanted to call it a fence could, and everyone would shake hands and go home. What's happening is the Trump administration is asking for a lot of things under the auspices of the wall, or a policy wall, that are very fundamentally substantial changes to the immigration system. They use terms like loopholes in the law. They're doing things with their executive power that are transformative, that most people aren't paying attention to because it's not a wall. It's not, you know, an individual gaining or losing status. It's some very, you know, legal minds putting their heads together and coming up with really transformative things that look very small. So I would just implore all of you to not get distracted by the symbol of the wall because it's easy and attachable, and really try to dig into some of the policy things that are happening, which in a lot of ways are a lot more transformative and important debates to have. So thank you so much to all of you for coming and those of you who tuned in, and thank you so much to IOP for inviting all of us. I'm going to assume on behalf of all of us, much gratitude. We enjoyed this conversation very much. Thank you.